Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very excited to kick off these monthly interviews with folks that I very much admire and respect and have served in many ways mentors to me, as we are celebrating 20 years of my service of work with the Children's Environmental Health Network, which has been really an honor. I have learned a great deal. I'm still learning, and I think considering all that we are going through and witnessing in our lives these days, I really do believe that the work of child health protection is needed more than ever. So I'm very honored to have Peggy Shepard with us today. Hi, Peggy. Executive Director of We Act, West Harlem Environmental Action, where you have also been a wonderful, longstanding, important leader for the entire movement of environmental justice, community justice, public health, and on and on. So we are going to kick off our interview today, and very excited to do so. So Peggy, I would appreciate if you could please share the story about how you even became connected first with We Act and the strategic leader that you are today.
Oh my God, well, the shorter version is that I had spent some years working, using my journalism and public relations skills to work in political campaigns. And after I had worked in the first Jesse Jackson for President campaign, and then the Mondale Ferraro campaign. The campaign operative, Bill Lynch, who helped David Dinkins become the first Black mayor of New York City, asked me if I wanted to be behind the scenes or if I wanted to be out front. And so he suggested that I run for Democratic district leader in West Harlem, where I had moved. And he linked me together with a man named Chuck Sutton, who was the nephew of Percy Sutton, who was one of the big three politicos in Harlem. And we were elected Democratic district leaders in West Harlem, started a Democratic club, and then our members came to us and said, there's this sewage treatment plant that is beginning to operate, and it's making us sick, and the odors are tremendous. And so we began an 80 organizing campaign, a volunteer, as part of my Democratic district leadership, as part of West Harlem Independent Democratic Club. And then we began to hold the city accountable for the emissions and the odors that were making people ill. We then began to realize that we saw a lot of people and kids with asthma. So we reached out to Harlem Hospital and Columbia School of Public Health to find out if they were seeing more emergency room visits from our particular zip code. And 2 years later, Jean Ford, who then was head of pulmonary medicine at Harlem Hospital and affiliated with Columbia, said that he had just completed a study that showed that the prevalence of asthma in Harlem was 3 times that of other neighborhoods in New York City. And so that really began our campaign around air quality. And of course, we were able to begin a strong education campaign for West Harlem residents to understand what a sewage treatment plant was, how we needed to address that. And we eventually reached out to the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and they filed a lawsuit against the city and against my good friend David Dinkins, who was then had become mayor after Mayor Koch. And Mayor Koch had always said, oh, there's no problem. We have all this odor equipment. You know, this is state of the art. When David Dinkins became mayor, he said, there's a problem. We're going to fix it. And so he committed $55 million in a front page, above the fold, 5-column headline, $55 million committed to fix the North River plant. And it made NRDC and We Act monitors of that fix-up plan and gave a $1.1 million environmental benefits fund to the community for environmental projects. So that was my start in environmental advocacy. And of course, once you begin to see one problem, you see a whole host of others. So we began to work We began to sue the Metropolitan Transit Authority for building another depot in our community across the street from a public school. At that time, 6 of the 7 Manhattan depots were all above 96th Street, which is what we call uptown. And so, yeah, we were off and running, and we were able to get a grant from the Benefits Fund to start We Act as a paid organization with some paid staff. And we've been off and running ever since, you know, evolving from simply working to stop projects and pollution, of course, which we will always do, but evolving into engaging residents to help develop the policies that we need to keep our communities safe and sustainable.
Excellent. It's extremely exciting, and we're so grateful for your level of service, Peggy, because clearly you could have gone many different ways, you know, these last many decades. And I know we're all so appreciative for your continued fight, because we need you. So thank you for that background. We know that we're living among some serious times. Advancing equitable community health has been a continuous challenge. The whole mission of We Act is centered around that, when we talk about just the US for starters. So with the economic climate that we're in, understanding with so many folks laid off, people that were already having major issues with job security even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are so many different ways that families are struggling to figure out how do they prioritize, where should they prioritize their energy. We are among, you know, just what, 14 weeks now before maybe one would say, I would certainly say, the biggest election of our lifetime. What, and maybe it's an unfair question, but what might you recommend that many of us really keep our eye on and try to prioritize when we talk about a serious movement and pivot for this country towards community health that's truly equitable for all? And I know there are so many pillars of that, but if you wanted to pick just one priority in that arena, I would be so grateful.
Well, I think We Act, as well as the Children's Environmental Health Network, have been very strong in environmental health and helping the public to understand the impact of environmental exposures as a prime contributor to the determinants of health. So since that's sort of my lane, I would say that the public has gotten a taste of environmental exposures and health outcomes in this whole COVID pandemic. Certainly the Harvard studies have found that people who lived in communities with high levels of air pollution had more negative outcomes from COVID. And now they're also finding out have more negative health outcomes from other chronic disease endpoints as well. So certainly I would like to, and certainly with the Children's Environmental Health Network, really focus on that as an inflection point to really begin to raise the consciousness and education around the impact of environmental exposure and health. I think the public has fully understood that, and I think for the first time, because of COVID, they're now even hearing on a national level that air pollution can really be a significant problem in terms of health equity and chronic disease. And so when we think about health equity, we're thinking about the socioeconomic determinants of health. And we have to remember that environmental exposure is one of those key determinants. We also know that your zip code helps determine your health. Well, your zip code really gives you a snapshot of the conditions that you are living in, and those are housing conditions. So we're living in housing segregation, and in much of rental housing in big cities, we know that the indoor air quality is very bad due to lead exposure, lead poisoning exposure, due to mold exposure, and other kind of contaminants, whether it's from gas stoves or from personal care and household products. So really raising the visibility about those kinds of exposures and how we need to address those is certainly one way that I see my organization at We Act really making a contribution to health equity.
Excellent. And I and Children's Environmental Health Network stand ready. So we'll continue our conversations offline because I know that this is ever changing, and capacity is always a need for all of us to do all the wonderful work that we need to do. But I'm certain we will get there. So thank you for that, Peggy.
I think, and I think one of the issues also that we need to confront is that environmental health, environmental justice gets about 1% of all environmental funding in this country. And that is just a crime, yeah, because we now understand how important environmental conditions are on our health and our well-being, and especially on the development of infants and children. And we now know that those environmental exposures can have an intergenerational impact through the decades. And so we really have to work together and with other of our allies and colleagues in the field to ensure that we can begin to develop stronger health equity in this sphere.
Yep. So agreed and so necessary. And, I couldn't say it any better. The need for capacity is so vital. If we have not seen that, even with I'd say CDC's ability to respond to the biggest pandemic of our lifetime, I don't know what is. They are supposed to be the biggest public health agency for us at the federal level, and yet I know for a fact, do not have all of the capacity that they truly should have to be ready for something like this and to assist health departments. And then when we go to the community level, whether it's COVID or food deserts or air quality concerns or transportation issues or mold and radon issues in schools and on, clearly that's where groups like We Act, and organizations like the Children's Environmental Health Network that want to help lift up and leverage and further strengthen and further amplify the incredible, effective, shown to be effective work that needs to happen. And we need funding and we need capacity to do that. So
Absolutely.
Thank you, Peggy. So switching gears a little bit to climate justice. I know that you spent a great amount of your time serving as a change agent and continue to do so for the urgent issue of climate justice in this country. And I've said many times that COVID, I think, is our, climate change rather, is our next COVID, if you will. All the signs are here. Prevention is about, protecting us completely from a certain concern. If we can't prevent, then we contain. In my humble opinion, we did not necessarily do that all that well with this COVID pandemic as a nation. And we are suffering some of the consequences from that. Are we willing to continue waiting? We are already seeing the ramifications of climate change. I think Serbia has some of the highest heat weather patterns on record right now. Serbia, in the when you talk about the global stage. So when it comes from your position, what priority climate actions? Again, there are many that have co-benefits to the many issues that we're discussing even earlier. What specific climate actions that have implications to children would you recommend that we collectively focus attention, capacity, and energy towards? There's a lot of great mitigation and remediation strategies and many different groups now working on these. And finally, health has risen, to some of the attention. But groups like We Act have been talking about these issues for a very long time, and with a lot of climate justice leaders across the country. So if you would like to lift up some of those co-benefits to the actions that you were speaking about that also can help mitigate some of our climate needs, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I believe that there cannot be climate justice without environmental justice. Our communities have a legacy of pollution. They have a legacy of disinvestment that impacts the health of our children. One of the issues that We Act has been working on significantly is the urban heat island effect. And it is the issue of extreme heat, which is caused by climate change and exacerbated by climate change. And, you know, we talk a lot about sea level rise and flooding, but the fact of the matter is that more people die of extreme heat every year than die of sea level rise or flooding. We know that the most vulnerable populations, which are children, the elderly and immunocompromised, are the ones who are most at risk for impact from extreme heat. We know, for instance, you know, I was working with Patrick Kinney at Columbia School of Public Health. He's now up at Boston University. And he said that air conditioning should be a prescription for some people. And that we really have to ensure that the most vulnerable people are able to have a condition of cooling when we have extreme weather events. So in New York City, especially given COVID, when people are asked to stay at home, so we're all staying in the house longer. We also have to remember that, you know, right now it's like 90 degrees outside here in New York City. So we have to understand that over 50% of people living in public housing in New York City do not have an air conditioner. And for those who do, many cannot afford to run that air conditioner because of the energy bill. We already know that over 30 million households in this country are energy insecure. And so as well as policies, and as we transition to a greener economy, energy costs may go up for a while for many people. And so how do we protect the most vulnerable families from that rising cost and begin to subsidize those bills? So we've been looking at the LIHEAP legislation, or LIHEAP laws, that really focus on heating in the winter, but we now have to have them understand that cooling in the summer is also a critical factor for health. And of course, if our families and our breadwinners in our families do not have the capacity, that makes our children even more vulnerable. And we know the millions of children who are living in poverty, and of course that makes them more vulnerable to a variety of climate impacts that they may experience depending on where they live and the region of the country. For instance, if you're in the Gulf Coast, there's already a legacy of chemical and oil refinery pollution. You have toxic waste sites. Some communities have 30 and 40 toxic waste sites. So what happens when there's flooding? Or if you're in South Carolina or North Carolina, where you have combined animal feed operations, or CAFOs, and you're fence lined to one of those, and the ground is contaminated, and you're on well water, and of course you have an extreme weather event with flooding, and all of that contamination contaminates the soil and your wells. Again, the impact on children who are just developing. And so really looking at climate change and health is very important, but you can't look at that without factoring in the legacy of existing current pollution in those communities that will now be exacerbated with sea level rise and other extreme climate events.
That's right. And you're definitely speaking truth to power. There's evidence to show just in some of the major hurricane events, for example, that we've witnessed the last couple of years, Rita and Maria, and the devastations in Puerto Rico that are still not back to where they should be years later. The Houston Gulf area, of course, the Carolina, we are seeing the implications of this, and we don't necessarily hear much about it. So I appreciate you raising those very valid points. This is a state of emergency, and we have to treat it as such. And we know that we cannot continue to just wait by. We have to get very serious about the systems that need to be adjusted in a very fundamental way. to really make the type of turn that we need. And as you mentioned, to protect the most vulnerable who are already vulnerable on a regular day. So thank you, Peggy. All right, I did say earlier that I personally believe that this election coming up, this national election, October, about 14 weeks away, is the biggest of at least my lifetime. And I say this because of the levels of atrocity that this administration has presented to us. I believe it's challenging at times for the average American to truly understand all the many ways that the unraveling has strategically been happening, but it's been happening. And as WEAC knows, as Children's Environmental Health Network knows, we have seen such attempts in a modest way, I would say, in previous administrations, but literally to be putting out fires almost every other week. You know, our office is on Capitol Hill, but prior to COVID, I mean, you were hard pressed to pick in your daily schedule which many hearings to go to, which many places to get on record regarding rollbacks in our air quality, in our public health standards for air quality, and the provisions and progress we've made to date, understanding we still have miles to go. Water quality, housing, you know, obviously criminal justice that even goes well beyond our direct mission, but it's atrocious. So with the election, and I would add not only national elections, but obviously the importance of local elections, right? We all should know and understand that who we elect into these positions, not only with the budgeting of where our tax dollars go and how they're spent in our communities or not spent, but also how these folks are equipped to respond to the needs, not only in a preventive way, but if prevention is not available, primary prevention, obviously, to recover as quickly as possible and to not fight science, to listen to public health, to heed those that know and are trained to know better than where you're positioned. It takes a humble being to do that, right? So as folks are thinking about this next election and the voting public, and in our collective attempts to continue to make vulnerable populations and vulnerable populations like children at the forefront of people's minds, because it's not just what we're doing today, but it's what these implications will do for the next generation that we should be focusing on. What advice do you have for all of us as the voting public when we're thinking about our candidates out there, when we're thinking about the type of personalities, when we're thinking about, you know, who do we want to best serve for us in those moments of crisis like we're in right now? And who, when we're trying to figure out and look at criteria as to who would be the one to stand up when it's the hardest time to do so, and to be a true agent of change for vulnerable populations across this country.
Yes. Well, the first thing is that we've all got to come out in November and vote out President Trump. He is a disaster for the country, for our standing in the world, and for our communities. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. And then the second thing is that we really have to organize locally. I think what we have really understood over the last 5 or 6 years is that when the federal government is not fulfilling our needs, that the states, many states have taken up that mantle and been very progressive and have moved the kinds of policies that we had hoped would happen at a national level. Some of those policies have been happening at a state and city level. So who we elect at a local level does really matter. And I do understand that there are going to be some places, especially in the South, where they don't have as much opportunity in terms of options, in terms of electing people who are not beholden to industry. But we still have to do that organizing. For instance, you might think, well, what can I do just as a regular person? Many people live on a block and have a block association. Many people have a homeowners association. That homeowners association can develop a candidate briefing where they invited candidates in and let them know what they think are the salient issues that they want addressed, and where they can hear from a candidate about again, that's another way to take some control and to let our elected or candidates know that we are a force. We're going to be monitoring them. We're going to be watching them. And by the way, here's our agenda that we expect you to follow if you want our vote. And I think we can do more of that at a very local level. You know, people, you know, when they're back in college, colleges can do that on their campuses, bring local candidates in to talk about those issues as well. Because local issues do affect college campuses and youth who are, you know, living for 4 years in a different town than they grew up in. And so we all can take that kind of electoral approach to really holding people accountable. And we have to understand that each one of us has a responsibility. And I would like to think that at the end of my life, that I could be able to say, I've been a change agent, even in my little part of the world. Maybe not on the world stage, but my little part of influence. Have you been able to make life better than the life you were born into? And to me, that is an important value and guidance for my life. And I think we all need to think about how we can be that change agent in our little part of the world.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. So well said. Well, you were a part of the blueprint for protecting children's environmental health that was created back in like 2014, 2015. And for those that don't know, it's on the CEHN website, and We Act, and Peggy personally was heavily involved. We did a big retreat. We did many pre-meetings. Out of that guidance that is available for any of us working to protect children, it's not just the Children's Environmental Health Network tools for the field. There were a variety of different high-level priorities that were identified, and we tried very hard to think outside the box. In our retreat that further developed that blueprint, many of us we're still, you know, of course, overwhelmed with the amount of coverage, the amount of topics that need to really be addressed. The amount of education needed, the amount of training needed. But we brought together communication expertise, legal, some youth advisors, economic advisors, which you still rarely see in some of these discussions, but are so fundamental, and on and on. We Act has been, you know, a huge part, and Children's Environmental Health Day was one of the cornerstones, I think, that was developed out of that blueprint. As you know, as We Act has been a wonderful partner the last 5 years, Children's Environmental Health Day is every third Thursday of October, which is Child Health Month, and is a day of action. There are lots of days of observances, right? But this is a day of action for and with our youth, our children. Little steps all the way to quote unquote big steps. We track them all. And I'm wondering, as we are approaching, again, this will be just before this election, this is during a worldwide pandemic, there's a lot going on. We still believe, obviously, that there are steps, and we do highly encourage community members, the like, to think about how they can lift up that day, that week, that month, in a safe, healthy way, of course. Might you have a suggestion of an action that you've been a part of or seen that has had or is in the process of having a very positive return for children that you would like to lift up, even if it's a case example of some sort?
Yeah, you know, I would like to see our child health researchers working with advocates and doing briefings for our elected officials and policymakers on 2 to 3 key advances they could make on policy that would help our children. For instance, we were able last year to develop a Child Safe Products Act. After 10 years of work, we were able to do that, and we would like to see that happen in different counties and cities around the country. And I think it would be great to put out a model draft of what that kind of policy could look like, and work with groups around the country, or just moms getting together to advocate for a child-safe model legislation.
That's right.
And I think that's something we could all do, whether it's signing on to a letter, whether it's putting a call in to your local elected, whether it's organizing a lobby day and just going to your local office of an elected or going to your state house.
Excellent. And that's something that I know we very much are interested in aligning with. So yeah, we'll add that to continued discussion, but you're right. There's a very important, well-evidenced frame and template. Why would we not try to model that and take away some of the heavy lift right now for communities that, quite frankly, are very much desperate for such a type of legislation? So thank you very much. And if anyone's looking for that, I believe they can find out more information on the We Act website on that act, Safe Products Act. So Peggy, as I mentioned earlier, we are all so lucky to have had your leadership all these years, and We Act especially has been able to hold on to you for so long. Why have you stayed with We Act so long?
I had a number of jobs in my career. I started out as a journalist and have worked as a magazine editor and worked as a public information officer in government. And this has been the only place where you could really have a vision and implement it. And I put a high value on that. I don't know of anything more satisfying than being able to walk down the street and see us in these cities now highway to walk to West Harlem Piers Waterfront Park that used to be a parking lot, and now you have families able to congregate and enjoy the aesthetics of the Hudson River, or being able to know that when a baby sucks on a pacifier that it is a safe one without BPA. So all of those kinds of victories and actions keep me going and feeling that I am using my talents in the right space.
For sure. And there are so many studies that I know I personally quote often. Many of them are the Columbia University studies that We Act has been the translational community partner on for a long time. And that is vital information that those of us out here in the children's environmental health field have to lean on. Knowing now that within a 500-foot proximity, a child, otherwise healthy child, could then have onset of asthma, along with a variety of pesticide exposure studies in housing and pregnant women. I mean, it's just been phenomenal and so incredibly important for the foundation of this work, for the integrity of this work. So I'm so appreciative and grateful. Who has been someone you have admired and why?
Someone I have admired. You know, I am inspired by so many everyday people. I'm inspired by you. I remember when you were just a neophyte with the Children's Environmental Health Network, and all of a sudden we had an emergency and needed a new director. And we said, come on, Nse, you can do that. And you've stepped up and been there all these years, having 4 children of your own and running an organization. And I know, and I'm sure a lot of our allies know, how difficult it is to fundraise and sustain a small nonprofit for decades, especially nonprofits that are run by people of color and women of color, knowing just even from philanthropy's own reporting that do not get as much of the resources as they're given out. So I'm inspired by people like you. Was a very young person when you had to take over that man, accept that responsibility. I'm inspired by people in the political world. I'm inspired by Hillary Clinton, and I'm inspired by Elizabeth Warren, and I'm inspired by Stacey Abrams, as well as scientists I work with, Ricky Pereira and others who have just been at this for so many years. and really developing the kind of science that ultimately, because of some of us translating that work, will benefit our children.
Thank you, Peggy. You're so gracious. It's been an honor. And like I said, to learn underneath you, you were on the board, as you mentioned. You've seen me kind of grow, but it could not have been without our board, you know, helping to step in and support me. And along the way, it's been really exciting. So my final question is a little bit leaning towards, you know, two of us now as nonprofit leaders of, you know, rather small but mighty national nonprofit leaders. I know you've had a lot of interns over the years, staff, many folks you have mentored, whether you've known it or not. What might be some great advice for the up and coming, you know, emerging leaders in our field? And our fields are, you know, public policy, environmental justice, community health, public health, you know, on and on. Health economists out there that are so vital to quantifying the benefits of healthy air and healthy water and all of that. Any advice for them? I know they're job seeking and they're obviously up against a lot of competition, but in general, any plugs you want to make for looking at a nonprofit in a serious way, and why that might be a good look for them, and what they may obtain as far as skill set and life learning?
Well, I think internships are very important, especially if you diversify the kinds of organizations that you might intern with. It really gives you a sense of what the culture of those organizations are and what the flow of work is. So I think that's a really good entry-level experience into the work world. But it is not significant work experience. I have a lot of people, young graduates who apply, and they say, I have 5 years of experience, and they're all 2 to 3 month internships. Internships are wonderful, but it is not a full-time job. And let me say what I mean by that. A lot of young people come in to an organization, they stay a year or two, but let me tell them, it takes a year, especially in a small advocacy organization, to really begin to contribute. You're doing tasks, but it's going to take you about a year to get up to speed on that sector, on those building the relationships, and understanding the culture and understanding your agency within that culture. Often in a small nonprofit culture, you can be very entrepreneurial. So it's definitely a place for people who are self-directed, who are confident, and it's also a place to build confidence. You will find that you are able to interact on a much higher level than you could in a large organization. For instance, I have staff who are in the 24 to 29 years of age. They might be our liaison to the city council. They might be going to a meeting that has been called by the mayor. They really get to really do a higher level of work than you could do in a larger organization where you know, the VIPs of that organization are getting all of that kind of face time and external interaction. I also feel that young people need to stay at an organization for several years. Most of them are leaving within a year and a half. Maybe they make it to 2. But believe me, by the time you're at 2 years, you're just beginning to make a contribution. And when I say contribution, you also want people in a small organization who are going to help push the institution ahead. Not simply, you know, these are my 3 tasks and I'm doing that. And that's great. But what really makes a contribution is when your work advances the organizational mission and helps grow the organization. And you cannot do that in 1 or 2 years.
It's excellent. All such good advice. I hope you all are listening very, very closely. And by the way, the fact that Peggy mentioned that she's not adverse to putting a, if you will, a more junior person on a very influential board at a city level council speaks again volumes to the type of mentorship and respect and a little bit of, gentle push that Peggy, you bring, because we all have to kind of spread our wings, and you don't know, you have to be in these uncomfortable situations to know your potential. And I would highly support, any of you out there. We need the energy. We need your expertise. We need your commitments. We need your ideas. More than ever. I would add, please, but be realistic and be thoughtful about where you look to find employment and or fellowships and internships. They're all very positive, and they will teach you something no matter what the experience. And I know we all have more than enough work that could use some assistance. Well, Peggy, thank you for being a part of my village all these many years. I really respect you. I'm so appreciative for you. Thank you for your time today. And we will definitely be talking about these many important partnerships to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and best of luck, best wishes.
Thank you, Peggy.